In my 42 years on the bench, I've seen arrogance walk through that courtroom door in many different forms. The wealthy who believe their money buys them a different set of rules. The connected who drop names like their currency. But I want to tell you about a case that stayed with me long after the gavel came down, because it wasn't just about one woman's behavior. It was about something deeper. It was about what happens when someone believes, truly believes, that their status in this world places them above the people who run into burning buildings to save lives. When this case landed on my desk, I had to remind myself, as I always do, that in my courtroom, a CEO's wife and a school teacher stand on exactly the same ground, equal and accountable. When this case landed on my desk, I read the charge sheet twice, not because the language was complicated, it was straightforward enough. Obstruction of emergency services, disorderly conduct, and harassment of public safety officers. I've seen those charges before, but the details behind them, those gave me pause. The complainants were Lieutenant Danny Reyes and his crew from Engine Company 7, 4 firefighters responding to a reported gas leak on Elmwood Avenue on a Tuesday afternoon in October. A gas leak isn't a small thing. A gas leak is a ticking clock. In a residential neighborhood, every second matters. You evacuate, you isolate the line, you protect the people who live there. That's the job. These men knew it and they were doing it. The defendant was Mrs. Claudia Harrington, 44 years old, wife of Gerald Harrington, the CEO of a regional investment firm. She was driving a late-model Mercedes SUV and had parked it, at some point during the emergency response, in a position that directly blocked Engine 7's secondary access route. Now, I want to be fair. Parking in the wrong place during a chaotic situation, that can happen. People panic, people freeze. I've given benefit of the doubt to folks who made honest mistakes in emergency situations. But as I read further into the incident report, and as I reviewed the body camera footage submitted as evidence, I understood why this case was referred for prosecution. This was no honest mistake. What concerned me most, reading through those pages, was a single line in Lieutenant Reyes's report. He wrote, "The subject was informed 3 times of the emergency nature of the situation and refused to move her vehicle, stating, and I quote, 'Do you have any idea who my husband is?' I've been doing this long enough to know that when someone answers a public safety emergency with a question about their husband's identity, we have a problem that goes well beyond a parking violation. Let me walk you through what happened that Tuesday afternoon, because the details matter. Engine Company 7 received the gas leak call at 2:14 p.m. Lieutenant Reyes and his crew arrived on Elmwood Avenue within 4 minutes. Outstanding response time. They set up their primary perimeter, began evacuating residents from the nearest homes, and positioned the engine to access the utility corridor on the east side of the block. That's when, according to the body cam footage, which I watched carefully twice, Mrs. Harrington's black Mercedes SUV turned onto Elmwood and came to a stop directly across the access lane. Lieutenant Reyes approached the vehicle immediately, calmly, professionally. I could see that on the footage. This man had every reason to be frustrated, and he was composed. He knocked on the window and said, "Ma'am, I need you to move your vehicle. We have an active gas emergency on this block." Here's what I saw on that body camera, and I have to tell you it took me a moment to process it. The window came down about halfway, and Mrs. Harrington, sunglasses on, phone in hand, looked at this lieutenant in full firefighting gear and said, "I'll be 2 minutes. I'm picking up my dry cleaning. I've been doing this job a long time. I thought I'd heard everything. But sitting at my desk, watching that footage, I felt something I don't often feel before a case even begins. Genuine disbelief." Lieutenant Reyes repeated the request, clearly. "Ma'am, this is not a parking situation. There is a gas leak on this block. You need to move your vehicle now, for your own safety and the safety of the residents." Her response, and I watched this 3 times because I wanted to be certain I was seeing it correctly, was to roll her window back up and return to her phone. 2 more firefighters approached the vehicle. A 3rd time they explained the emergency. A 3rd time she was asked to move. And according to both the body cam footage and the written statements of 4 witnesses who were being evacuated at the time, Mrs. Harrington stepped out of her vehicle, looked at Lieutenant Reyes and said, loud enough for everyone on that street to hear, I pay more in taxes than you make in a year. Move around me. That statement, right there. That told me everything I needed to know about what I was dealing with. The crew ultimately had to call for a secondary unit to reconfigure their approach, losing 11 minutes of response time on an active gas leak. 11 minutes. In my experience, 11 minutes in an emergency is not a minor inconvenience. It is potentially a life. As I continued reviewing the evidence, the picture only became clearer and more troubling. The body camera footage was Exhibit A, clear, time-stamped, and damning. But there was more. 3 responding firefighters had submitted written statements, and they were consistent down to the specific words used. When statements align that closely without collaboration, in my experience, that's because they're telling the truth about what they witnessed. Exhibit B was a series of photographs taken by one of the evacuating neighbors, a retired nurse named Mrs. Patricia Gomes, 71 years old, who saw the confrontation and had the presence of mind to document it. Her photographs showed the precise position of the Mercedes, the yellow emergency tape, the clearly visible engine 7 markings on the apparatus, and Mrs. Harrington standing outside her vehicle with her arms crossed. What struck me about Mrs. Gomes's statement, she said something simple that lodged in my mind. She wrote, "I've lived on this street for 30 years. Those firefighters are the reason my family is safe. I couldn't believe what I was watching." There was also a recorded phone call after the confrontation on the street, while Lieutenant Reyes's crew was still managing the emergency. Mrs. Harrington had called, not 911, not any emergency line, but the department's non-emergency administrative line to file a complaint about Lieutenant Reyes for, in her words, harassing a private citizen. The medical component, thankfully, showed no injuries to the firefighters or residents, but the gas leak itself was significant, a compromised line that, according to the utility company's emergency report, had the potential for serious incident within 15 to 20 minutes of discovery. They managed it. Engine 7 managed it, despite the 11-minute delay. When I finished reading every page of that file, I sat back and I had to ask myself the question I always ask before I hear a case. What is the right thing to do here? And the answer was clear. By the time Mrs. Harrington's court date arrived, I had been informed by my clerk that the body camera footage from Engine 7 had been released through a public records request, had been picked up by several local news stations, and had accumulated, at last count, somewhere in the range of 6 million views across various platforms. My clerk, God bless him, showed me some of the public comments. People were angry, parents writing about their firefighter sons and daughters, veterans writing about public service and dignity, ordinary people writing about what it feels like to watch someone treat a first responder that way. I'll tell you what I told my clerk. It doesn't change a thing about what happens in that courtroom. I've had cases with no cameras, no viral videos, no public attention. Cases involving quiet people who deserve justice just as much as anyone in a trending video. They got the same process. They got the same consideration. The attention doesn't elevate a case in my eyes, and it doesn't pressure me toward any particular outcome. What the public attention does occasionally is remind people that they are watching, that accountability is real, and maybe that's not the worst thing for a courtroom that believes in transparency. But when Mrs. Harrington walked through my door, she was going to get exactly what every defendant gets from me: fairness, a chance to speak, and the truth. When Mrs. Harrington walked into my courtroom, I observed her carefully, as I observe every defendant. She was dressed immaculately, not inappropriately, but in a way that felt deliberate, a statement. Her attorney was beside her, a man I recognized as someone who handles high-profile civil matters in this city. She sat down, adjusted her jacket, and looked around the courtroom with an expression I can only describe as impatient. Lieutenant Danny Reyes was seated in the gallery with 2 members of his crew. They were in dress uniform. They sat quietly, back straight, hands folded. The contrast in that room was not lost on me. I called the case and addressed Mrs. Harrington directly. "Mrs. Harrington, you've been charged with obstruction of emergency services and harassment of public safety officers. Do you understand these charges?" Her attorney began to respond, and I raised my hand gently. "I'd like to hear from your client directly, Counselor. Mrs. Harrington, do you understand what you're charged with today?" She looked at me and said, I understand the charges. I also think this is a significant overreaction to what was a brief misunderstanding. I let that word sit in the room for a moment, misunderstanding. I said, I've reviewed the body camera footage from Engine 7. I've read 4 witness statements, including those from your client's own neighbors who were being evacuated at the time. I want to give you the opportunity to help me understand what I may have missed. I paused. Mrs. Harrington, when Lieutenant Reyes informed you 3 separate times that there was an active gas emergency and asked you to move your vehicle, what was your understanding of the situation? She straightened in her seat. I was told there was an issue. I wasn't told it was life-threatening. I felt I was being spoken to in an aggressive manner, and I said, the body camera shows Lieutenant Reyes speaking to you calmly on all 3 occasions. Calmly, clearly, professionally. Are you disputing what's shown on that footage? There was a pause. I'm saying my perception was different. I've been patient with a lot of defendants in 42 years. Patience is part of the job, but there is a difference between someone who is frightened or remorseful or confused, and someone who is simply recalibrating their story in real time. I could see which one I was looking at. I said, I'd like to play the footage for the court. We played it, the entire relevant sequence. The courtroom was silent. I watched Mrs. Harrington during the playback. She looked at her attorney. She looked at her hands. She did not look at Lieutenant Reyes. When it concluded, I asked, Mrs. Harrington, the woman in that footage, that is you? Yes. And you're heard saying, I pay more in taxes than you make in a year. Move around me. Is that an accurate recording of what you said? A long pause. I was frustrated. I said, I understand frustration. Frustration is human. But I want you to understand something about the man you said that to. I turned briefly to acknowledge Lieutenant Reyes. That is a man who, on the morning of this incident, had already responded to 2 emergency calls before yours. A man who joined this department 19 years ago and has been decorated for his service. A man whose crew protects the neighborhood where you and your family live. She said nothing. Then my bailiff brought something to my attention. A printout that had been submitted as a supplemental exhibit by the prosecution. I reviewed it at the bench, and I have to tell you, I had to take a breath before I spoke again. It was a screenshot from Mrs. Harrington's social media account, posted 2 days after the incident. A photograph of her Mercedes captioned, "When the help gets a little too big for their britches, back to normal now." I looked at those words on the printed page. I looked at Mrs. Harrington. I said, "Is this post from your account?" Her attorney leaned over to whisper to her. She said quietly, "Yes." I said, "The help." I let that phrase stand on its own for a moment, because it deserved to. Mrs. Harrington, Lieutenant Reyes and his crew are not the help. They are public servants. They are the people who would run into your home if it were on fire. And 2 days after blocking their emergency response, you posted this. I looked at her for a long moment. She was no longer adjusting her jacket. She was no longer scanning the room with that expression of impatience. Something had shifted. I then turned to Lieutenant Reyes and asked if he wished to address the court. He stood and he spoke briefly, but what he said moved everyone in that room, including me. He said, "Your Honor, I don't take this personally. I took an oath. I'll keep showing up, but I do hope she understands that the 11 minutes we lost, that's 11 minutes in somebody's house, somebody's family." I thanked him, sincerely, and I meant every word of it. I've been on this bench long enough to know that sentencing is not about making yourself feel righteous. It's not about the gallery, and it's not about the cameras. It's about the person standing in front of you and what they genuinely need to hear and to do in order to become better. I looked at Mrs. Harrington and I said, "I want you to understand something, and I want you to really hear me." I paused and let the room settle. In 42 years on this bench, I have sentenced people for serious crimes, violent crimes. I've also seen people make honest mistakes and shown them mercy. What I look for, always, is whether the person in front of me understands the weight of what they've done, whether they have any genuine recognition of the harm caused. I paused again. You came into this courtroom and called a life-threatening emergency situation a misunderstanding. You referred to decorated firefighters as the help on your public social media. At no point, Not in your statement to officers, not in your testimony today, have I heard you say the words, "I was wrong," or "I'm sorry." That troubles me deeply, not because I require performance, but because without that recognition, I'm not confident you've learned anything from this experience. I took a breath. Lieutenant Reyes told you that 11 minutes matters. He is correct. What I want you to sit with, truly sit with, is that there were families on that block. There were elderly residents being evacuated. There were children. And every one of them was less safe during those 11 minutes because you decided that your errand was more important than an emergency response. Then I delivered the sentence, and I explained each component clearly. Here is what I am ordering. First, a fine of $2,500, reflecting the seriousness of obstructing emergency services, not a symbolic amount and not one meant to be easily absorbed. Second, 200 hours of community service to be completed with the Providence Fire Department's community outreach program. I want you working alongside the people you dismissed. I want you to understand their work from the inside. Third, a formal written letter of apology to Lieutenant Reyes and Engine Company 7, reviewed and submitted to this court. Not a formality, a genuine written acknowledgement of what your actions cost them that day. I looked at her steadily. This is not punishment for punishment's sake. This is an education. The fine reminds you there are legal consequences for endangering others. The community service gives you the opportunity to replace one image of yourself standing with your arms crossed while firefighters plead with you with a new one, and the letter of apology is the beginning of accountability. I leaned forward slightly. I hope you use this time to think about the kind of person you want to be, because wealth, Mrs. Harrington, is not character, a title is not integrity, and a CEO's name does not make a gas leak wait. After I adjourned court, Lieutenant Reyes and his crew stood, and several people in the gallery began to applaud. I rarely allow that in my courtroom, but I let it go for a moment, because honestly, those men had earned it. Mrs. Harrington stood very still. Her attorney was speaking to her, but I don't think she was hearing him. Something had finally reached her. Sometimes that's how it works, not in the heat of the incident, not in the days of rationalizing afterward, but in the quiet of a courtroom where everything is laid out plainly and there's nowhere left to look away. She wasn't crying, but the composure she had walked in with was gone. And I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say it because it told me that somewhere in there the lesson had landed. I spoke briefly with Lieutenant Reyes afterward. I thanked him for his testimony, for his professionalism throughout the entire ordeal, from the street to the witness stand. He shook my hand and said, "We just do the job, Your Honor." And I said, "I know, that's what makes it matter." The ruling itself was shared widely online. The comments were overwhelmingly expressions of gratitude, from firefighters, from their families, from ordinary people who had watched that body camera footage and felt something was finally set right. I read some of them, I appreciated them, but I'll tell you what I told my staff that afternoon. The validation of the internet is not why I do this. I do this because Danny Reyes and his crew deserve to walk out of that building knowing that the system they serve also serves them. That's the only response that matters to me. Let me tell you what I hope people take from this case, because I think it speaks to something bigger than one woman and one parking dispute. We live in a time when status has become confused with worth, when a number in a bank account or a name on a business card has led some people to genuinely believe they occupy a different tier of society, one where rules are suggestions and public servants are subordinates. In my courtroom and in a just society, that confusion has to be corrected. The men and women who run toward emergencies, firefighters, police officers, paramedics, they are not the help. They are the architecture of safety that makes everything else possible. Every business, every luxury, every comfortable life in this city exists in part because those people show up every single day, often for modest pay, and always with the understanding that they may not come home. When you obstruct that work, you don't just inconvenience a crew, you gamble with lives. I also want to say something about social media, because it came up in this case and it comes up more and more. What you post online is not separate from who you are. It is not a private thought. It is a public declaration of your values. When Mrs. Harrington posted that caption, she told everyone watching exactly how she saw the world. Social media doesn't create character, it reveals it. My hope for her is genuine. I hope she completes those hours with Engine Company 7 and that something shifts in her. I've seen it happen. People walk into community service resistant and walk out changed. That's what the justice system is supposed to do at its best, not just punish, but transform. After 42 years on this bench, that belief hasn't left me. Justice done with fairness and with purpose still has the power to reach people. I've seen it too many times to stop believing it now.